What are vaccines? How are they made? And how do they keep us healthy? We'll answer all of these questions and more on this edition of Getting Schooled. I'm Abby Hornacek. If you've been to the doctor's office, you probably know what vaccines are. Most of us have been getting them since we were babies. Those lovely shots we get in our arms that keep us safe and healthy are truly unforgettable. These days, there are a lot of immunizations available to protect people from the likes of measles, mumps, chickenpox, the flu, etc. But as the coronavirus continues, vaccinations aren't just important for small children and teens going off to college. Now, vaccinations have the potential to ease the wreckage of this pandemic, slow the outbreak that is affecting millions of people. As this pandemic continues, many of us have wondered what the coronavirus will mean for daily life. When will we be able to get together in large groups? How can we be sure that the virus won't come back with a vengeance once we've flattened the curve? One answer to that question is a vaccine. Now, that seems to be the golden word as of late as we look to control this virus. But how long does it take to make a vaccine, and when will a vaccine be available? There are so many questions to answer. And here to help us with all things related to vaccines is former Associate Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, aka the FDA, Peter Pitts. Peter served as the Senior Communications and Policy Advisor to the Commissioner of the FDA and is currently the President and co-founder of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest in New York City. Peter, when it comes to putting something into our bodies, it's important to know exactly what it is and how it can affect us, obviously. So I'm really glad you're here to help explain what we can expect from vaccines. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh, my pleasure. And that's a really good question because people assume that, if a medicine or a vaccine is approved by the FDA, that it is 100% safe and 100% effective, and that's not the case. Safety is a relative concept. But certainly when it comes to vaccines, the payoff, which is basically an immunity against a disease, is so profound and so important that the risks become more acceptable. And these days, when I talk about risks for vaccines, I mean, do you have a reaction? Does your skin get itchy? Relatively minor things relative to being made immune against a variety of diseases. And there's been a lot of press recently about people that don't want to get their kids vaccinated, for example, because they feel it causes autism, which is 100% fake. So as we talk about as moving forward towards a vaccine for COVID-19, I think it's also a teaching moment for all of us to recognize the urgency of all types of vaccine.
So I guess I should ask you this for the people who are listening. Obviously, the general idea of a vaccine is that it's something that keeps us healthy, fends off a virus infection, more of the like. But what exactly is a vaccine and how does it help us manage illnesses? What goes on in the body that makes that happen?
Okay. So let me answer that question in two ways. Firstly, what a vaccine does is that it gives your body an immunity against a virus. It's like saying that at one point you were standing in front of a brick wall with somebody throwing a baseball at your head. And the vaccine allows you to step behind the brick wall so that when the ball hits the brick wall, you don't necessarily get harmed. The value of a vaccine for an individual obviously is very important. It keeps that person healthy. But more importantly, when there is a vaccine, it's important that everybody get vaccinated. That's called the herd effect, HERD, that if we all get a vaccine, the virus leaves our community. I'm Jewish, so we're in the Passover season, and the concept of, for example, wiping lamb's blood on your doorpost so the angel of death passes by your home. That's the concept. If the broader the community vaccination rates, the lower the chances are that disease, that virus, will impact the people who aren't vaccinated. So when people say, "Well, I don't want to get my kids vaccinated," the point is, nothing works unless we all get vaccinated. That's the herd effect. Relative to the flu and COVID-19, same exact proposition. That's why we're socially isolating now and sheltering in place. We're taking ourselves out of harm's way. We're denying the virus the fire it needs to burn. That being said, vaccines need to be developed for a variety of reasons, and it's hard. And you really have two hard problems to solve. The first is the science problem. How do you actually isolate the antibodies and then understand how to create a vaccine to combat it. This is something that we do every year against the flu. And so obviously it takes more or less a year to develop a new vaccine against that year's strain of the flu. For things like a vaccine against pertussis, whooping cough, or polio, or a whole variety of childhood diseases, those take longer, but you generally have longer development times. You have to do more intense and larger human trials. So vaccines don't all proceed from conception to approval at the same rate.
Is there a certain guideline that tells us we need a vaccine? Obviously, you can look at what's happening with the coronavirus and say, okay, we need a fix to this. But is there a strict guideline that there has to be a certain amount of infections or something like that before it starts development?
So if there is a disease for which you want to develop a vaccine, the regulations state that you have to go through safety trials. So the first thing you test for is the drug safe, not even necessarily effective, but safe. And then you have to do safe versus effective. And then that's a ratio because you don't want the cure to be worse than the disease. So it's all very much relative to the disease that you're discussing. So let's take the flu, for example, the annual flu, a very serious, very deadly proposition. You don't want a flu vaccine that's going to cause death, or severe reactions, because if you didn't get vaccinated against the flu, you could simply ride it out at home with a lot of liquids and rest and tender loving care. For more fatal diseases, I'll give you an example like Ebola, which is 100% fatal. You really need to develop a vaccine with that in mind. So you'd be willing to accept bigger negative side effects to make sure somebody's immune against the Ebola virus.
Sorry to interrupt, but before you go any further, just for clarity purposes, when you say you don't want the vaccine to be more dangerous than the illness, are you referring to the fact that it's because we use the germs in a vaccine that is that germ is what we're designing something to fight against, but we have to use it in the vaccine to build up immunity, correct?
Yes, that's one of the ways. So clearly, let's use smallpox as an example. So smallpox was one of the first diseases where scientists understood that by giving the body a little bit of the disease, you can help it build up immunities.
So how do you find the balance between having the right number of those germs where you can build an immunity and having too many that make you sick?
Aha! See, that's exactly the right question. Because on the one hand, you have to understand the severity of the disease you're trying to fix. And if the disease that you're trying to fix isn't really that big of a deal, you probably wouldn't have a vaccine in the first place. So as you work your way up the mountain of disease severity, you're looking for a vaccine that's going to do the maximum amount of assistance and the minimal amount of harm. Not all vaccines give you 100% immunity; they give you partial immunity. So there are a whole variety of data points that you're looking at.
I know you mentioned one potential risk of a vaccine, but why do you think so many people are anti-vaccine if that's the case?
There's so much misinformation out there. And of course, everything you hear on the internet is always 100% true. It also reinforces what people, I think, want to be true. Let's take polio for an example. When my parents were kids in the 20s and the 30s, polio wiped out communities. It destroyed millions of lives. It was the fear of every parent. We found a vaccine and it miraculously vanished. But now, so people say, well, why should I get my kids vaccinated against polio? There's no more polio around anymore. And the answer is, as soon as you stop getting people vaccinated, the virus returns. Viruses are very smart. They're very powerful. Mother Nature wins all the time. That's why we as humans need to be extremely smart and follow the best advice relative to getting inoculations. The myth that vaccines cause autism is just that, a myth. Andrew Wakefield, who's the British doctor who kind of published the first article on this, had his medical license taken away. The journal that published the article retracted it. It was nonsense, bad science. But yet it seems to stick, whether it's polio or whooping cough or measles. A lot of parents don't want their kids vaccinated, and that's completely the wrong proposition. I know a lot of people who are pediatricians, and when I ask them, what do you tell parents when they say they don't want their kids vaccinated? And my friends say, listen to their patients, if you don't want your kids vaccinated, you can't have your kids in my waiting room.
Right. So my mom got the flu shot last year and she ended up getting really sick from the flu shot. Do you think that's just because maybe she happened to catch the flu despite the vaccine, or do you think it was the vaccine that caused that?
A lot of people will get a vaccine and have a bad reaction to it. They will actually have the symptoms of the virus that they're trying to fight. It happens all the time. Some people are super sensitive, and it's good to know that. As we move forward towards a COVID-19 vaccination, you want to be able to tell your physician, listen, I generally get the flu shot and I respond very badly to it. The more information we can give our doctors about our own personal healthcare experiences, the better they can design a treatment protocol for us specifically.
Right. So I've read a lot about vaccines and how they're made, but can you tell me how exactly does that process happen? Where does the materials to put into the vaccine come from? That kind of thing. Well,
unlike a pill, which is difficult just in and of itself, making a vaccine is about 100 times more complicated because you're dealing with live antibodies. You're dealing with vaccines versus tablets. The manufacturing of vaccines, which really gets very little attention, is difficult because, one, there's very little money to be made in manufacturing vaccines. So the result is, come from a basic Econ 101 proposition, there are very few companies that make vaccines. So the first problem is volumetrics. Can we enlist enough companies to make a COVID-19 vaccine while they are also making other vaccines? These plants are difficult to build, they're expensive to maintain, and they're tough to regulate. Vaccines are made from living organisms. We can also do it synthetically. So we've become a little bit more sophisticated in how we make vaccines. But that's kind of been on the back burner of healthcare for about 10 years. The technology to do it better, faster, cheaper exists. It's being tested by a lot of manufacturers. But generally speaking, we're still doing it the old-fashioned way by growing these cultures in chicken eggs, which is how it's done. And that's obviously very time-intensive, and I suspect the chickens don't like it very much either. But we absolutely have the ability to move beyond that. So maybe one of the silver linings of this conversation is we're finally going to move vaccine manufacturing into the 21st century.
Can you take me a little bit deeper into the approval process for vaccines? Are government agencies outside of the FDA involved in a vaccine's ability to be accessed by the public?
There are two agencies that generally deal with vaccine regulation and recommendations in the U.S., and the first is the FDA. And it's linear, and the second one is the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. The FDA's role is to work with the vaccine development company to figure out the design protocol. How do you take the research? How do you do the clinical trials? How do you move from animal trials to human trials? How many humans do you need in those trials? What does the data say? And that really ends up in a equation of safety and efficacy. Does it work against the virus, and is it safe enough relative to the risk of the virus? That takes a long time. It's very expensive. Clearly, for the annual flu vaccine, it's a shorter process because you're talking about a regular 12-month cycle, and everybody understands how to do it. That's the other thing, too, is when it comes to a virus that you understand, you can move more swiftly. Once a vaccine has been approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, it then moves over to the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. And CDC's job isn't to reinvent the safety and efficacy equation, which the FDA has done. The CDC's role is to determine whether that specific vaccine should be put on a national rollout plan. And the reason that's important is if the CDC gives it a thumbs up, then for all intents and purposes, the government pays for it. And if it doesn't, then only people who can afford to buy it through private insurance or out of their own pocket have access to it. So there's a degree of redlining if the CDC doesn't deem it important enough for the broad population. Now, for COVID-19, what's interesting is, in my opinion, we're likely to have a number of different vaccines approved to combat COVID-19 coming onto the market at more or less the same time. Some will be more effective in certain populations. So one vaccine might be better for an older population, others for a pediatric group, others for somebody else, people with pre-existing respiratory conditions, for example. And they're going to be developed through different methodologies. So the question is, one, will FDA be able to look at all these vaccines individually and get them through the market in an expedited way without rushing? Rushing causes mistakes, and you never want that to happen. But I think that you can expedite these things by putting more human resources against these things. This is clearly a top priority, and I think that's going to happen. I think where it becomes a little bit more dicey is will the CDC give its seal of approval for more or less public funding to a whole variety of vaccines, or will choose only one or two? And that's largely based on a kind of a mysterious review process that needs to be a lot more transparent.
All right, we've got to step aside for a quick recess, but we'll be back right after this.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network, download and listen to Tyrus and Tim.
Well, I'm taking it very seriously because as soon as we can get through this, the better all of us will be. But during this time, we have to not look at this like a prison sentence, but like looking at it as a duty. Like a lot of people are talking about treating it like we're in wartime. But I think if you look at it like that in a more positive, like just we're doing our part opposed to we're stuck together.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
So you say that there are going to be potentially different vaccines for different groups of people. What about when the virus mutates and evolves? I'm not a doctor, but I'm sure we're going to get some sort of mutation of COVID-19. So are they going to have to develop a new vaccine for that, or do they tweak the one they have, or do you just keep it the same?
Well, just like the annual flu, every year we need a new vaccine. Because first of all, it's not a vaccine that you get once and you're done. This is a vaccine you have to get every year because the virus mutates, evolves, learns. Remember, viruses are living things, and living things want to survive. And the way viruses survive is by finding a host, i.e. a human being. So yes, probably every year we're going to need new COVID vaccines. But once we break the code, which is what we're working on right now, we'll be able to get it done on a regular basis as we do now vis-a-vis the flu.
How are they tested? Who's the first human who gets it?
Well, these are tested in clinical trials, which means that the company that's manufacturing the vaccine recruits, a whole variety of types of patients. First, you want to recruit healthy patients, and the value of giving a vaccine early in its development process to healthy patients, you want to make sure that it doesn't cause harm. Those are called safety trials. Then you want to start giving the medicine to people who are more at risk to see whether it actually works from an effectiveness standpoint. And all of this data put together and analyzed allows the FDA to understand the vaccine in this risk-benefit balance.
Obviously, we don't want to rush things like you mentioned, but given our present circumstances, what can the global health community and our government here in the United States do to expedite the process? What have you seen? What have you heard?
Well, I think there are a couple of answers to that question. The first thing is, how important relative to other countermeasures is a vaccine? And I don't want to call a vaccine a magic bullet, but it's as close as we're going to come to actually solving the problem. That's going to be crucial. Once you give somebody a vaccine, they kind of they get to get on with their lives. They get to go back to work. If they're healthcare workers or firefighters or police officers or teachers or the people that put food on our supermarket shelves, those people are able to do those jobs without fear of getting very ill. The story these days of healthcare workers contracting COVID-19 it's just the worst possible scenario. And these people are healthcare heroes, obviously. But there are other things that are also important. For example, how do we help people in high-risk groups, older people, people with pre-existing conditions, get through COVID successfully? How do we help mitigate their symptoms? How do we help shorten the course of the virus? And that's where things like chloroquine come into the conversation. How can we repurpose existing approved therapies against COVID-19? How do we look at drugs that are currently experimental, not approved for anything, and allow those to be used under a doctor's supervision and discretion for people who are extremely ill? And then how do we look at drugs vaccines that, for example, combat HIV, AIDS, and malaria, the antiviral group of medications? Are they going to be successful against COVID-19? The answer is we don't know. And we can't rely exclusively on anecdote because the plural of anecdote isn't data. But the FDA has, I think, been very flexible in granting what's called emergency use authorizations for these drugs, as well as for many of the diagnostic tests for, on the one hand, positive or negative for COVID, or also positive or negative for COVID antibodies for people to identify people who have already had the virus. And the FDA has been very flexible in terms of saying, listen, it isn't approved. We don't have all the data that we like. So on the one hand, we want you to continue collecting kind of gold standard randomized control data. We need to see that. But also we want you to start if you're using these products in real patients in real time, we want to see that data as well. That's called real world evidence. So I think because of the severity of this pandemic, the FDA has taken extraordinary measures to do things that it might not otherwise do. But to answer your question specifically relative to how is this going to impact bringing a vaccine to market quicker, I think it's exactly the same thing. I think the FDA is going to look at the data with a much, I don't want to say a less degree of severity, but they're going to understand that there are still going to be a lot of unknowns and that we're going to have to accept having more unknowns to bring these products to market quicker.
Mm-hmm. Well, based on what you're saying, it seems like the FDA is learning as it goes. I mean, as it should, because this is such an unknown circumstance that we haven't really experienced before. But have there been any other instances when the United States had to create an emergency vaccine like we're seeing right now?
Well, I think the best example we've got is HIV/AIDS. And this is interesting because there are so many parallels. So in the 1980s, there was a lot of research into how do you create drugs or a vaccine to combat HIV/AIDS? And the communities that were impacted by AIDS are saying, listen, we can't afford to wait 5 years for the traditional clinical trial review program to say yay or nay. We want to have those trials continue, to have the data collected as usual, but simultaneously we want a parallel track where these patients can be treated with these experimental medicines because they have no options, they have no hope. And interestingly enough, the federal official who pushed this concept the hardest was none other than Anthony Fauci. So we have somebody right now in government who understands the concept of having to help people right now with a slim degree of evidence.
It really is hard to, with a slim degree of evidence, it really is hard to wrap our heads around what we can be doing right now. And we're very lucky that there are people working day in and day out trying to figure this out for us. Given your expansive knowledge of public health and drug management, how are you feeling about the outlook of the coronavirus moving forward?
I think that on the one hand, I'm extremely proud that we as a nation have understood the concept of social distancing and sheltering in place. I think that considering who we are as a nation, especially here in New York, when you walk out on the streets and people are not on the streets, or if they are walking their dogs, they're wearing a mask. We're taking it seriously, and we understand that right now we are the solution that we're seeking. So it's kind of our 9/11 moment. It's our chance to be the greatest generation by basically sitting on the couch in our living room. And as simplistic as that sounds, obviously making it happen has been a difficult proposition. So I'm feeling good about that. Relative to bringing a vaccine to market, there are a lot of companies around the world working on a vaccine. It's everybody's top priority. Every company, large and small, every country in the world is focusing on making this happen. So I believe that a technological solution will be forthcoming in 10 months to a year. And from vaccine standards, that's actually pretty quick.
10 months to a year.
Yes. And considering all the high-powered brains that are thinking on this, maybe even faster. And combine that with the likelihood that the regulatory authorities, FDA in the U.S., other initials, in other parts of the world, will say, listen, in a perfect world, we'd really like 6 months, 7 months to really study the data. They're going to recognize that is no longer a possibility, and they're going to have to move it forward faster. And of course, there'll be tremendous political pressure brought to bear to make that happen, which is a good thing. You don't want regulators to get overly comfortable doing things the old-fashioned way, but you also don't want to pressure them to a point where they're going to make a lot of mistakes.
Okay, Peter, tell me this then. So 10 months to a year, we have a vaccine, best case scenario. Just being in New York, I can just picture throngs of people rushing to get this vaccine. How do you manage that? And I don't know if it's just a big city thing but how many people will be authorized to give this vaccine, and how do you ensure that people will actually go and get it?
One of the problems that COVID-19 has raised that we didn't really see coming, and we probably should have, is that of kind of healthcare logistics. Not only
right.
vaccines. So, for example, right now, how do you get ventilators from where they are to where they're needed? Where are all the masks, gowns, gloves for healthcare workers? How about tests? Where are all the testing machines? Do we have enough test strips? In terms of drawing blood for convalescent plasma measurements, where are the tests? Where can it be done? But I think vaccines probably a good place to start, because once there is a vaccine, and considering what we've just gone through, what we're still going through. I want to be first in line for sure, as do many other people. We're going to have to start prioritizing. So, and that's going to be on a state by state, region by region proposition. So I would think we'd have to start developing right now a rollout program for who gets vaccinated first. And, obviously once you get past healthcare workers, public safety officials, firefighters, and so on, it can't be redlined. It can't be people who can afford it. There needs to be some national plan to get it done. Now, the problem is we all have very short memories. And as disastrous and life-changing as this pandemic has been, I suspect that once we're 6 months past, the crisis point and we're getting there sooner every day, a lot of people are going to go, I couldn't get a vaccine, so I'm not going to really worry about it. There has to be a plan. It has to, and I'll tell you something else. It has to be mandatory. We've really backed off making, for example, childhood vaccines mandatory. I believe that they should be. That's another conversation. But when it comes to things like COVID-19, how could we not make it mandatory after
Can
we're
you
just going
do
through
that with all the people who are anti-vaccine? Can you make a vaccine mandatory?
You can if you want to, and it's going to take a lot of effort. I was shocked a couple of years ago where I think in New York State wanted to make it mandatory for nurses who work in hospitals to get certain vaccinations. Nurses. And the nurses said, absolutely not. You can't force us to get vaccinated if we don't want to. So the degree of emptiness in people's heads, even educated healthcare professionals, is pretty astounding. So what has to come along with a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination program is a enormous, well-funded and ongoing public education campaign. And that hopefully would also have the positive consequence, the design consequence of having people have broader faith in vaccines writ large.
This is kind of a random question, but in terms of where the vaccine is inserted, are there more places on your body that are more effective at accepting the vaccine than others? Obviously, when you draw blood, you're looking for the vein, but vaccines are different, right?
I think once you inject somebody with a vaccine in the proper way, there really isn't a change in degrees of efficacy. Clearly, some people have sensitivities in certain parts of the bodies more than others. But I think what's also going to be very important is as we design the vaccine, you also have to design the methodology through which that vaccine is introduced into the human body. And there's a lot of interesting science going on there at the same time. But I think for right now, we're focused on getting the vaccine invented, approved, out to the general public, because the other problem here too is, like I mentioned earlier, manufacturing vaccines is tough. So the day after the vaccine is approved, you're going to have to start manufacturing the product. Where? I don't know. If it's one company's vaccine, will 6 companies be given licenses to manufacture it? Don't know. Lots of intellectual property, patent issues, and we've got to figure that out right now, because shame on us if we lose 1 hour arguing over these sorts of things. We need to figure it out. We need to figure it out right now.
Yeah, this definitely is a test for us as a society, us as an economy. I mean, there are so many challenges right now. Peter, last question. What have you been doing in self-quarantine besides thinking about how you're going to be first in line to get the vaccine?
Well, I'm learning that I can wear a suit jacket, a shirt and a tie, and no trousers. So when the sheltering in place order comes down, I think a lot of American men are going to be bringing suit jackets and shirts to the dry cleaners, but no trousers.
And the trousers are probably easier to dry clean. Well, so these poor dry cleaners.
Well, COVID-19 is impacting so many places in so many different ways. I think one of the takeaways here is once this is all over, we can't forget the people that are stocking supermarket shelves, driving buses and subways, out there every day doing collecting garbage, things that, we don't think about, that we don't always necessarily respect. These people need to be rewarded and respected in the same way we're talking about doctors, nurses, and cops and firefighters.
Yeah, they definitely are true heroes. And I'm glad that we're bringing light. I feel like when this isn't happening with the coronavirus, or when it hasn't been happening, we tend to overlook those healthcare workers. And I think it's really great that we're shedding light on all the things they do for us. So hopefully we continue to do that even after coronavirus settles down a little bit.
Well, I think it also it reinforces the importance of working in government. Working in government is a crucial function, and the public health officials in government now are just doing a hell of a job.
Right. I agree with you 100%. And you did a heck of a job as well on this podcast, Peter. Thank you so much. We learned so much about vaccines, or I did anyway, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. So really appreciate you coming on. Hopefully you're wearing that suit jacket and your tie for this podcast, even though we can't see you.
Well, I won't tell you the truth, but stay safe. Good luck.
Thank you. Stay safe, Peter. Thanks again. If you missed anything from class, these are my office hours, and here are some top takeaways about vaccines. Number 1, Peter estimates a vaccine for the coronavirus in about 10 to 12 months. Number 2, there's obviously a lot of controversy surrounding vaccines, but Peter personally thinks that they should be mandatory. Number 3, he guesses that different types of vaccines will be rolled out for different groups. And number 4, Peter's tentative to call a vaccine a magic bullet, but in reality, it could be what allows us to return to our jobs and normal life. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com, and don't forget to subscribe to this one on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and leave us a review. This has been Getting Schooled with Abby Hornacek on the Fox News Podcast Network. Class dismissed.